1965, Mary and our children, Tom and Susan, came first in order that the kids could commence school, which started in late August. And I had given 3 months' notice to my employer in New Jersey, so I didn't arrive until the last day of October of 1965. And tell them where we lived.
Well, we lived in Bill Way's house, which has been torn down. It was on the bay. It was the first house that you could see when you came over the causeway, but it was a long way down there. It was down,
What's now called Anhinga.
Anhinga, yeah.
Had no name.
So that was the only available 3-bedroom unfurnished house that we could rent. And we put that together with renting store space, and then we figured we'd figure out what to do to earn a living down here. Figured the island needed most everything, so we should find something.
Well, when we left here, we went home to New Jersey via Daytona Beach, and in the hotel room there, we actually read the Yellow Pages and started to make notes of various things we thought we could operate in or out of that little tiny unit, which measured 18 by 18. And it's down where Jerry's is now. It was immediately adjacent to the community church.
It was called the Sanibel Center building. And what was in there? The water company was in there, the library.
Library, Sanibel Captiva Real Estate.
It was an antique store.
An antique, but I'm not sure that didn't come later. That came a little later. That was...
Jeannie's Snack Shack.
No, well, we had
That's
the
what-
snack. That's what
that
we
was-
bought.
That wasn't Jeannie's then. That
No.
was...
That came much later.
But that was closed up with all the food and everything else in the refrigerators, and it had been closed up like that for 3 months. Everything was awful. And we rented the place next door to it, which had been Dr. House's when he used to fly
Half
over.
day a week office space.
He would
fly from Fort Myers to Casabel. His
And,
registered nurse
Yeah.
is Charlotta Copper. She would pick him up, and they would drive to that area so that he could open up his little tiny office. The office was like all of those units, 18 by 18, and that was subdivided into a waiting room out front, and then 2 examining rooms in the rear. There was just running cold water, and the building, to the day it blew away in the tornado, had outside toilets. Not as an outhouse, but they were part of the building, but to the rear. And when we arrived, Dr. House had ceased to function as a physician on the island. So when we arrived, there was no doctor, there was no dentist, there was no druggist,
No bank.
no bank,
Nothing.
and very, very little. There were 635 people supposedly residing as year-rounders on Sanibel and Captiva combined, and there were somewhere around 300 accommodations, including half duplexes, hotel and motel rooms. So in addition to that, there was supposedly about 300 what we called winter residents who either owned or leased realty here, who would come and check in 4 to 6 months in the winter. It was a very enjoyable atmosphere. And we have felt right from the beginning, Sanibel was very much, very little different than it probably had been in the early part of the century, even then, because of the few people. Everybody knew each other,
Oh, yes.
and everybody helped each other.
You didn't have to walk far on the road for somebody that you knew came along and picked you up. So
That's
you
right.
could always get a ride.
You always had a ride available.
But,
I don't think you'd have to walk 5 minutes and somebody came along, offered you a ride because they knew you. The roads that exist today, there were obviously very few of them that existed, and those, such as Casabel Road, wasn't even paved.
no, that
It wasn't paved until about 72.
sand and shell. When Marshall Tabaki gave his old car to our son would go speeding down Casabel Road and skidding around the corners He said, well, I'm practicing in the sand because in case I ever go north and have to get back in the snow, I'll know how to handle a car in the snow. And,
Good excuse.
yeah.
I arrived on a Monday, and on a Tuesday was introduced by Velna Ridge at the Community Association. Mary, of course, already had attended their weekly, or rather monthly dinners, and I joined that evening. The next evening, I attended the Audubon Society, and we were all asked to introduce ourselves because being the beginning of another winter season, this was now the very early part of November, each person was asked to introduce themselves and how long they had been here. And I got up and I introduced myself and that I had been there 2 days. And Ann Jordan, who then became Ann Jordan Bryant, she married the mail carrier here. Kenny was from a family of homesteaders on Captiva, the Bryan homestead. It was up where South Seas Plantation is. In fact, the plantation people demolished it on a weekend so that nobody ever saw the thing disappear. Yeah. And if there was ever a valuable homestead that existed on the two islands, that certainly was one of them. Well, Ann was the treasurer, and she said, "You're not a member." I said, "No, shall I leave now?" Well, Ann and I, with that rather vitriolic introduction to each other, became very good friends. And Mary saw her as recently as a couple of weeks ago.
Just last week I saw her, yes.
But it was all in good fun. Glenn Rhodes was the butcher at Bailey's, and of course Bailey's store was the store that you have a piece of in the back here now. And Glenn was the butcher at Bailey's, but he was also the captain of the Island Rescue Squad. Captiva never had one, so Sanibel Rescue ran everything, volunteer, gratis, from the lighthouse to Redfish Pass. And Glenn recruited me. And I guess it was about that Thursday I attended my first fire meeting, and to which I remained a member for 24 and a half years. But Glenn was a very, very, very unusual person. He exemplified everything that was supposed to be on this earth in the spirit of just a good, solid, decent man. Glenn not just was captain of the rescue squad, but he was a total giving person, and he gave his own life to it. And I believe it was July of 1966. No, it was later. It was probably 67 or 8. He was on a rescue call. His son was working the call with him.
Marty should
I would have been with him, except I was tending bar at Isabel's Tavern, which is now Jacaranda, gratis, to help out Gert Webb, who needed the night off. She was ill or whatever. And Gert was Roy Webb's wife. Gert still lives here. And I heard the siren, and I saw the flashing light go by, and all I could possibly know was that Glenn was on the call. I had no idea who else or where they were going. And they were taking a heart attack victim into Lee Memorial, which was the only hospital in the county. Well, there was one in Lehigh, but that's so far out. And going somewhere on, I believe it was Cypress Lake Drive.
Cypress Lake School.
Glenn pulled over across the road, or off of the road, and radioed in that he had tire trouble or whatever it was, and he got out of the vehicle, and his son found him lying dead out there a minute or two later. And this is a person who truly gave his life for the cause of being a decent, honorable person.
Well, the first we knew, I got the phone call from Fort Myers to send somebody over for your vehicle. I don't understand why.
The communication system was what we call the fire bar. It was where a telephone number was rung, And incidentally, Captiva had an unlisted number in those days, if you can believe it. It's
You
true.
know that.
Oh, I did.
But I don't think historically it's recorded and whatnot.
You have to tell.
So, well, it's factual. And so one phone rang, and they all rang as those who were volunteers.
Well, I think another thing back then, of course, we had rented that Dr. House's office space, and we didn't really come up with anything, so that's when he called me from New Jersey and said, geez, if that little restaurant is still on the market, see if you can negotiate it. So
Yeah.
that's what we did, after talking to Paul Stalin, was the landlord for the building. And he agreed to cut a doorway through between the two, because we had already had a lease on the one piece. So that's how we got into the restaurant business, when we had 8 counter stools and inside tables and outside tables, and altogether 50 tables.
No, 50 seats.
50 seats, excuse
They-
me. Yes.
Makes a difference.
We paid all of $75 a month per unit, so that was $150 a month, which in those days was a good bit of money, because for a full breakfast, with all the coffee you wanted, with real honest to goodness milk to go in and not powdered or synthetic junk, pancakes,
Bacon, sausage.
pancakes, French toast, or eggs, 2 eggs, and choice of bacon, ham, or sausage. And I repeat, all the coffee you wanted, we charged $1, which was sort of the going rate then. And we
But,
did very well. We had
Without the bank, every business person carried their money in their pocket for a whole week. So you had a wad, and sometimes Bailey would call up and want to know if we had any change.
well, everybody helped
We'd
each
help
other.
each other out, get the money business straightened
No
out.
such thing as a competitor in the
No,
sense of if you ran out of cash and you needed it, you called John Pantinas at Coconut Grove, or you called Roy Webb at Golden Sands, or whomever, because they did the same with you. And if you needed a box of this or a crate of that, you exchanged with each other. And the next delivery, it was brought to them right from the truck. And as far as deliveries, there was one and only one delivery service that really functioned here, which I think was quite amazing. It was Terry Transportation, which in prior years had been the J.P. Carter Company. J.P. Carter was Paul Stalin and his brother and somebody else from Michigan, who owned the building where we had our little unit, or 2 units, called the Sanibel Center building. And that they owned all the land where Jerry's is today, up to the community church. And that was in itself rather interesting to see the evolution and growth of delivery service, because it went back to the ferry boat days, which we, of course, never saw the ferry boat. We came after it. They had been replaced by the causeway. But one truck, and that one truck delivered things such as a Sears Roebuck
Washer, dryer,
dryer, mattress. If it were furniture, it would be assembled by the driver. His name is Dick Henderson. All alone. And he tote the stuff in, out, and around and about and put it together for you. He carried all of Seal Test's dairy products, and they were the only dairy products on the islands, and that included ice cream. And the ice cream and sherbets were kept in what I called upholstered, they looked like small coffins, and with dry ice. And I don't know what your experience with dry ice, but whatever it touches is as hard as concrete, and whatever is 4 inches away is mush. So you had a very interesting situation with regard to the deliveries. But Dick was just a fascinating person, and he would deliver from the lighthouse to Redfish Pass, all alone. And on Sundays, which was his day off, he'd wash the truck, and he didn't even own it, Terry Transportation. So there was no refrigerated trucks. Then finally Holtz came over, and whoever else serves today.
What would you like to know?
This is fine.
This is fine. My early remembrance, yes, aside from getting that rescue squad going, because he was out day and night, and when they would go, it was over the causeway down to William Memorial Hospital. Then they'd have to sit in the waiting room, maybe an hour, 2 hours, till the victim, as you call, I call them
Well, we
patients,
call them victims.
were seen, and then if they were dismissed, then they brought them home or took them to the pharmacy to get whatever the prescription was and then bring them back. So they'd be gone 4 or 5 hours sometimes on one case. Well, I'd be making hamburgers maybe, or just sitting up in home waiting, because being the only house down there, I could just lay in bed and watch the causeway and see when that
It was a
vehicle came
strategic
back.
location.
It was very good.
But you also became our instructor.
But yeah, well, I guess I had about 5 students, so that we had some more to share the ambulance calls.
It was very interesting to see the lack of expertise throughout the county, because the only ambulances as such were the hearses that were owned by the morticians. And there was Engelhardt's had a hearse, Harvey's had a hearse, and I don't know, maybe a couple others.
Well, I think.
And the drivers knew absolutely nothing even about basic first aid.
But I think you got Lee Memorial to put those automatic doors in finally.
Lee Memorial, well, when we would go to Lee Memorial Emergency
Push the
Room,
door and hold the door and wiggle the stretcher.
Oh,
It was very difficult, and the patient
but
could
it
get
was
banged or
the
knocked
old part of the structure, and they had in emergency, there were probably no more than 3 examining rooms, and many times the person, the victim, never left the gurney because that was the only available space. But as Mary said, you'd spend hours there just sitting and waiting.
I suppose other people have told you how wonderful Father Madden was, and he was really the priest for both islands. Didn't matter what church or
He was
faith
the
you
chaplain
were.
of the islands.
He was, and he hardly got any sleep. He was really patrolled the place. He knew if your kid was home late or coming home late or wasn't there and you were concerned, he'd know where it was, or he'd go out and find it at a beach party or something. And what I wanted to say about him, oh yeah, he knew about a woman. She and her husband had come from we don't know where to work down at the colony. She was about 8 months pregnant. And of course she gave the story that her husband had a brain tumor and didn't have long to live, and so the whole big sob story. And so no doctor in town would take her on as a patient. So now the worry was who's going to deliver her. And this again, there was so much cooperation in Fort Myers with people who lived on the island. The pharmacist who was at the American Department Store, which is now a big, supposedly an automobile showroom or
It's
something,
out of
whatever it
business
is,
now,
it's
so-
all empty, I think.
Even as a
But
successor.
I went in and I said I wanted sterile gloves, I wanted sterile towels, I wanted this, and then he said, what are you going to do with this? I said, well, I have to fix up a kit to deliver a baby just in case. Well, he wouldn't charge me. They just gave me the stuff. And,
She is an obstetrical nurse.
but we were on our ready for a vacation, so I had to teach somebody. It was Preston. He was
Yeah, I think it was
scared
Preston
to
Wood.
death of the Preston. He didn't want to have to know how to do this. Well, believe me, they got her to the hospital, just into the emergency room just in time, so that they wouldn't have to do the job, because we were off on vacation when it happened. But,
Yeah,
there
it
were
was,
a lot of
Very interesting.
interesting ambulance calls.
And some very, very interesting people, because you got to know them rather in depth. Clarence Rutland, of course, obviously was one of them. Clarence has received, and justifiably, a lot of notoriety because everybody seemed to know Clarence, and those that never had the privilege of meeting him, information is passed down through the years conveying that. To this day, there's still articles in the newspaper that you come upon. But there were many other people who nobody really, or very few really got to know, and one of whom was here, actually, Uncle Art Gibson. I don't know how much has been ever stated about him, but he was a very, very interesting person. Uncle Art came in 1900 with his family to homestead up at the Wolford area, excuse me, which is now what will be the sanctuary. And they had come from Safety Harbor, which is the northern part of Tampa Bay. And as I recall, their family crops were frozen out in the freezes of 94 and 96 or whatever in the world, pre-1900. And they came here on a schooner. Uncle Art's father knew somebody who was captain of a coastal schooner.
I I guess Goldie and Alan could tell them.
Well,
what they
Goldie and
wanna know
Alan,
about
yes, would,
Uncle Art.
because Art worked for Alan in his final years as looking over the shop and so
But
forth.
Art and Clarence were the two,
But
the
they were
people
the
always
two
asked
senior
historical
citizen
questions, and they would always
authorities.
differ.
And
Neither
they
one would
always
agree
do.
with the other. We'd have them on
So
tape,
we
even
have-
when it came to a turtle.
Walking out Old Wolford Road, which was just a trail then. The Wolford Road was, of course, dirt, which Old Wolford Road
But
was
back
dirt,
in
but
the
only
old
about 4
cemetery
feet
up
wide.
there.
And heading
You know
towards
where
the
that
old
is?
1-acre cemetery, and there one hot Sunday morning,
Miss
there was
Gopher.
Art and Clarence
Clarence.
with us, or they were showing us around, and this gopher crossed the
Park
walkway,
path, yeah.
and you can hear the two of them laughing, that's a gopher and whatever. And I can still recall that the Art being a little bit older than Clarence, Clarence would always defer to Arthur. And Clarence said, "Looks like it's about medium sized. What do you think, Art?" And Art paused and he said, "Medium small." Which would have been about a ½ ounce lighter, I suppose. But that was it. The final authority was age. And
But Art took us, he was telling us about this forked pond that he had watched grow from the time he was a child
Yeah.
down Bowman's Beach.
Clarence had never seen that
No,
before.
because he never told where it was. He hadn't even told Clarence. And now he was going to tell not only Clarence, but us. And so we drove on down there, and then we got out and we walked through the brush and the mosquitoes. I thought, gee, he doesn't know where it is anymore. And we're plowing through all this stuff, and all of a sudden he said, "Stop. There it is."
And there it was.
And Marty was able to.
Well, upon his
negotiate, get it.
demise, we were able to get that moved out of there, and with permission of the landowner who didn't know it existed. There's no way in the world you would have ever found it because of the density of the other foliage. It appeared to be, if you looked up, as 2 trees. And it was just surrounded by all of this. So with the help of Alan Nave, who root pruned it and so forth, Tom Schnabel moved it down, and I negotiated with the landowner. We were able to get that moved to the fire station because Art had been indirectly involved, as all able-bodied men were in those days, with putting out fires here for like 50 or more years. And he was just a most interesting gentleman. Remain in our hearts,
Oh, yes.
along with Clarence and
And for me, Miss Willie Glass, of course.
Yeah.
And-
Speak of her, we haven't had anyone
Hmm?
speak about her.
Oh,
Miss
well,
Willie was.
Willie was the sharpest bridge player I've ever played with, right up till she was about 92 when she died.
She set up the only Grand Slam I ever had in my life.
But she was a night owl, and she loved to play cards at night, and Florence liked to play in the daytime. But anyhow, we would get together, and she was always hoping a good hurricane would come along and we could get together in her house and play bridge right through the hurricane. And so we played there at night. She had her, she lived there alone. She had a maid come in and so on during the week. She had 3 sons, and as she said, one of them keeps my bank account full, the other one takes care of my legal things, and the other one plays with me. He had a large sailboat, and he would take her sailing out in the Caribbean and so on. And she would go, there were times she said everybody was seasick, but she wasn't, and she was handling the boat.
Well, she did scuba diving, not just snorkeling, but scuba, and instructed Girl Scouts here out of a Boston whaler out in the back in Tarpon Bay, and then would take them in the Gulf after they got, we can't call it certified, this is before it was necessary. And she would take these girls out to do scuba. She had a 4-wheel drive Jeep.
She'd pick up strangers on the beach, talk to them, bring them in, show them her shell collection,
Just a
which was
great-
very
great
interesting.
lady.
And then take them in her Jeep and take them through Dingdarley and give them, he gave people tours too.
Well, everybody
Yes.
did, for free.
Left me with the dishes and the hamburgers. Now, listen, you were taking off that apron and running off on tours every time I turned
Well,
around.
a potential customer.
But
Might want
really,
another hamburger.
one son called her up, I guess every night to see how she was, but on this particular night that we played cards, and the phone would ring around 10:30, she said, now he knows. He knows I'm playing cards now, I'm not going to answer that phone. And when we'd finally leave close to midnight, and I had to drive all the way down to the Lighthouse Way, and she, of course, was on Gulf Drive up here, next to Snooks.
That's where she lived.
She always, yeah, now her house was moved, you know, and it doesn't look like her house anymore.
Mm.
But she would always make all of us call her up when we got home. Because she said, if I don't hear from you in the right amount of time, you might be in the ditch with an alligator or something. I'd call Smitty, who was the sheriff,
One deputy.
the deputy, to go looking for you. So you just had to be sure to call her up the minute you got home, or else you'd have somebody out looking for you. Next door was Floyd Snook and Maud, and they had their motel, which now is a condo and whatnot. And she said how she had a deep freeze, and Floyd loved to go fishing. And whenever he'd catch fish, he'd want to put them in her deep freeze. So he'd bring them over and put them in, and then as time went on, he wanted his fish, and when he did, the whole thing would have to be unloaded because now they were down the bottom. And she was sick and tired of this, so she said, I just called Sears Roebuck and I ordered a deep freeze and had it delivered to Snooks, and he had to pay for it.
Yeah. But that's how she operated, and she lived a wonderful life. She was agile, so she was, I guess, just about ready to pass.
She was only in the hospital a week or so
Yeah.
when she did pass away, and she was 90-something. Before that, she was very aggravated with herself. If she fell out of bed or something, she finally had to have somebody come in and stay with her.
But she was just great.
But she was just, well, her book is in the library. If anybody wants it, you can.
Have you seen
It's
it?
wonderful. Yeah, it's a marvelous book.
It's in
I don't recall if it was if her father or her grandfather. I guess it was a grandfather had left one of the southern states, Alabama, I believe, after the Civil War and went to South America, never came back because they had taken his slaves away from him. And that was a rather significant move for somebody, particularly in those days.
I think it was a Willie and Florence Martin and the three women that came down and tried to talk you into going into a really good restaurant.
Well, no, it was Florence and Jerry.
Florence and Jerry? No, there were three women. I don't know.
Yeah, well, that was separate.
Yeah, but that was something else, yeah.
You mentioned Bill Way and
Yeah.
Brent.
Oh, yeah.
Tell us something about Bill Way, because it's
He
another
was
one
wonderful.
we haven't.
Well, Bill Way was an enigma. Bill Way was probably one of the most high, I would think he would probably have one of the highest IQs of anybody I've ever known here. And there are many high IQs around here. Bill's application of it was somewhat different because they came here when it was still very, very primitive in the 60s or late 50s, I guess. Yeah, it was the middle to late 50s. And they built what was called Villa Victoria, which was a small motel.
Well, excuse me, but we were told how true it is that they came with $100,000.
Which was a huge
And
amount
that's a lot of money back then.
That's at least 10 million today.
So they acquired that land from the bay to the road.
From the bay to the road because they built what he termed as a botel. They were he was ahead of his time in everything he ever got involved with. And unfortunately, Hurricane Donna put them totally out of business, blitzed their property, knocked their dock into, part of it supposedly went into one of the motel rooms over on the Gulf side in Donna. It put 3.5 feet of water in their house, and we know because we rented that house for 20 months, and the high water mark was in every room and closet of that house where the seawater had come in. And they had built this motel. He built the Sanibel Marina. He had a waterworks of his own, out of his own well, a free-flowing well out in the front that had much tastier water than IWA, and I used to be on the board of IWA, and I even said it then. But with the intrusion of septic flow and so forth, that of course became
And he would have the foresight, he had it all piped all the way up Lighthouse Way from where he was down by the Seahorse Shop all the way up to the marina, which is all of Lighthouse Way now. He figured someday someday they're gonna build houses in there and he can sell them water from this line.
Then he brought it back in through Sanibel Estates. The very first two-story house ever built there was built by somebody named Floyd Benny, who was a retired government lawyer from Washington area. And that house still exists and is down opposite Kinsey Island. And Bill's water went all the way down there. He had little pump stations. And it's just an amazing person. But he sold fill that he would dredge. Of course, then you didn't go through EPA and all these other organizations. You didn't worry about Army Corps of Engineers.
Yeah, he had land up here on Arlington Road, you know, also.
Yeah. So one of, okay. So one of Bill's enterprises was Filled by Bill. And on the tail end of it was, he only had two little dump trucks. On the tail end of one, it said, "Get a load of this." But Bill was just a very amazing person. And unfortunately, nature took its toll on him. And the growth here did not reach the momentum that he had expected. So timing was very poor for him. Yeah.
He did a lot in Shaw Harbor, I think. He had the job of clearing that all out
Yeah.
for Lindgren.
That was an interesting thing, because compared to the type of equipment and apparatus that's available today, and all he had was a miniature drag line. It was one of these things on a World War II half-track, and the smallest drag line you could ever imagine. And he dug the better part of those canals down there. Similar, in a similar manner. Go ahead.
Well, you're talking about digging the canals. One that I don't feel, I feel there should be a marker in Ding Darling
Oh, yeah, for coal.
for Colin Moore, who dredged that whole road all the way through there. And there had been a place with a little wooden sign saying
Yeah,
Colin's
Colin's
Point.
Point.
That's probably
There
rather
is
than
a person who,
Charles LaBeouf said that he wanted to see a marker there.
Oh,
there should be.
And he had put that wooden one.
yeah, there should be some recognition for Colin Moore, who was just a big, raw-boned, wonderful Southern man who worked for the Lee County Mosquito Control. And he would work a week or two or three on a compass course, because the mangrove was so, as you well know, it's just so overwhelming that all he could do is aim in a general direction and start digging and heaving it up. And those compass courses would be given in by Tom Wood. I guess Charles has mentioned Tom. Tom was the senior U.S. Fish and Wildlife agent here, who had an airplane, a government plane, a float plane, whose landing strip, so to speak, was the little mosquito canal in the back of Bailey's Tower down here off of Top on Bay Road. And Tom would land there and then have to get out, pull himself around and aim back towards Top on Bay Road, which was his base, and then taxi down there, because there was no room to maneuver it under power. So he'd have to actually pull the plane around by its wings and aim back down there, and then out of 55-gallon drums, hand pump the fuel into it with the old wobble pump like Bailey had on his kerosene cans that when we used to buy kerosene. So Tom was somebody who was a very interesting person in his own right. He had flown in the Navy in World War II, but he had flown back, I guess, as far back as probably the 20s or the 30s. And some information came to our attention at one time that he had, whether it was true or not, I have no knowledge, but he supposedly had the highest number, or the record, the world's record for takeoffs and landings on floats for an aircraft, which could very well be, because he was up and down, up and down. So there was a very interesting character.
Yeah.
Of course,
Also
everybody,
mention Paul Stalin.
Yeah, oh, yes.
well, I don't want to miss my favorite all-time person. Probably
Okay.
my favorite in life is Esperanza Woodring, who we had the very good fortune of being very close to way back when we had our little business, because she would help us out
She'd
there
come in the evening and
things.
finish the cleaning up.
But Esperanza is, of course, number one, but I'm sure many people
Sure.
have spoken of.
But Paul was our landlord, and you couldn't have wanted a better landlord. I mean, people have many different ideas about Paul, but here we rented the place, and we needed furniture. Well, he said, "Come on up, Chelsea, we're renovating the dining room, and you pick out whatever tables and chairs you want." So we had good, solid tables and chairs.
Oh, we had beautiful captain's chairs, unbelievable.
And so we had everything we needed. We
The
didn't have
nickel
to
and
buy
dime
any
operation.
mixers or silverware or anything else. He provided it all. Painted the place. This is Joe Whiteman. How about him?
Yeah, all of the maintenance, other than our own equipment, was handled by the landlord. And Paul was, like Mary said, we've never had a better landlord in our lives. Paul would make use of, for an electrician, Joe Whiteman. Joe was the only electrician on the islands. And you've interviewed Joe. and,
Captiva has.
Captiva has, and probably one of the world's most interesting people. And Joe, of course, worked barefoot with 110 volts for 220 put on shoes. And Joe would fly his airplane barefoot. Of course, Val, the wonderful musician at St. Isabel's, plays the piano and the organ barefoot. So maybe there's an extra sense to it. But Joe worked 110 barefoot, and it was a very interesting thing. We had a counter that was split. There were four stools on each side. And just at about high noon one day, when the place was mobbed, Joe came in to repair a fluorescent fixture over the counter and set up his ladder and climbed up, and here at just about face level with people eating with his pair of bare feet.
Dirty bare feet.
As this high-pitched voice electrician is jabbering around up on the top of the ladder. But this is how
We
things
didn't
work.
charge for the show.
No.
We had one day, we had
In
a
addition-
monkey come off the roof, down on the tables outside, grabbing hot dogs and into the Coke, and everybody screaming and they had to grab their food and come on inside. And then wildlife was out with a net trying to catch the monkey.
Well, Marilyn Hines
Marilyn's
from Hines
monkey.
Golf Station was an aficionado of
She loved
wildlife,
all
and
kinds of
she
animals.
picked this monkey up over in Fort Myers, and he got loose. So anyway, as Mary said, it took the Fish and Wildlife people to, I think even Chucky LaBeouf, who could, he was just a small boy then, but Chucky could climb a grease pole. And I think even Chucky was up on the roof trying to shoot him down. But it got into the newspaper, and by gosh, if Leon Waretsky, or whatever in the world his name was a health officer at that time. Lee County only had one person checking restaurants, and you'd see Leon about twice a year. And he came over and wanted to find out about this animal, because that was against the law for us to have wild, uncaged animals on the premise.
He didn't know we had a snake too.
But it was interesting. Speaking of Snake, reminds me of Snake, who owned the business before we bought it. Snack Shack existed before we came on to Sanibel. It traded under the name of Snack Shack by our predecessors. That was Aubrey and Anna Southwood, or Southworth, I forget. Southward. They had come from Virginia. They were friends of Ralph Woodring's from the Air Force. And Aubrey got himself in a heap of trouble at Isabel's Tavern. Now Jacaranda had then earlier been known as Risingers, because Isabel's married name at that moment was Risinger. And Aubrey took a swat at some man who was making derogatory remarks about women in the military service. And Aubrey's wife had been in the Air Force. And I guess in the moment of whatever, Aubrey took a swing at him, and this person struck the
One of the kids
floor
who helped from
and
Sanibel.
hit his head on a plate that was supposed to be in it and was killed. So Aubrey was up on a manslaughter charge. We didn't know this when we bought the business, not that it affected us in any
But
way.
that's why it
But
was
that's
just
why it
closed
was
with
up
all
for
the food
sale.
and everything in it.
Oh.
They just gave up on life, you might say. But then Aubrey eventually was exonerated, and it was not intentional. And time, a couple of years went by, and they left the island. But it was unfortunate that it had to be that way. But his nickname was Snake because he raised
That back room smelled of
Snakes.
snakes. They have
On a
to smell.
damn day
There
it
was a
smelled.
smell back there. He kept the snakes. Did Clarence ever talk about murders on this island?
There was,
There was one he talked about, a man that had a lot of gold teeth in his head. And he had a friend who, at that time, he said, still lives in Fort Myers, but
I
he
don't
says,
know.
that man disappeared. And
Well, there was one up in the Wolford area that,
up in
Yeah,
there, he said
yeah.
there was a well. He kept
Yeah.
saying, if they went down that well, they'd probably find, or they did, I don't know.
he'd
Minus
come
the
in on
head.
a boat.
Yeah.
It was,
Yeah, that's,
the
the
name
head was
Riley
gone. He
maybe or something
thinks
like that.
this
Coming
so-called
back.
friend took the head with the gold teeth.
Well, there was also, when they started to dig Sanibel Harbor's subdivision, I was involved with it as the real estate broker, as one of the brokers. And Clarence said, when they started to dig out there, I hope they don't come up with a body, because he had stated that somebody had been murdered out there too.
No?
So this was a rough and ready place, I suppose, particularly back in Prohibition days.
I don't know whose skull was in our house up on Captiva, but we got a skull along with the house.
Yeah,
Did we give it a Christian burial?
no, well, I buried it. It had a hole in the back of it, so I
So
don't
it
know
must have
if
been
it
a
was
shot.
shot or what.
Well,
That's
we
why I
had the
buried it.
same with Mary Cunningham's place that we bought.
Yeah,
That was interesting because they said the stagecoach robber had built it. Black Bart, there was quite an article in the paper about Black Bart and
he was
and the
written
house.
up in, his name was Raymond Holtz. Ours is Holtz, his was Holzey,
But-
probably a Hungarian name.
Yeah, but Joe knows about him.
But Joe Whiteman knows about him, but that's
That's Captiva's story, yeah.
So that, like we say, there was just wall-to-wall characters that seemed to reside here and gravitate here.
We had a lot of fires back then. Gosh, they'd go on, brush fires.
Well, the brush fires.
Would go on and on for days, and the Coconut Grove and what's his name down here?
Roy Webb.
Roy Webb and we would get together, everybody be making sandwiches and cold soda and trying to deliver it out there.
Well, the last,
While they were fighting
yeah,
us. and
the last
go on.
supreme effort that I came upon with that was, I'm sure it's been done since, but the last one that stands out in my mind was Roy Webb wound up through diabetes with having his legs amputated, and he was still functioning with one leg and a crutch. And he had brought cases and cases of cold beer and soda to us, and buckets of ice, and he was unloading that from his little pickup. It was with a crutch, man with one leg doing this on his own.
He had the biggest heart, that's probably why he didn't do so well in business, because he gave away so much wherever he saw anybody needed it.
But it's the evolution of the having no police, well, one deputy. Smitty was like, I reiterate my statement, no police. He was something else, and apparently his predecessor, who we didn't know, was even more difficult. However, it was quite a place here. My first contact with politics here was at an election campaign in which Snag Thompson, who was the county's sheriff for 24 years, he's still alive, still lives in North Fort Myers, had a cookout or barbecue or whatever, and where was it but down the lighthouse property, which is federal land and the Hatch Act and everything else absolutely forbids such things. But there was free beer and eats, so everybody was down at the lighthouse to shake hands with Snag. That was my first meeting with him, and if Snag ran upon me or whomever in Fort Myers, and you could be on the other side of the street, he'd yell over, "Hey, Holtz, how's everything on the island?" There was a politician, and of the old school, and he ran the county, I guess the way the county had to be run back in those days, because there was, I'm sure there were problems, but back in the 50s and the 60s, they really didn't come to the forefront like they did today. So there was a character. He didn't reside here, but everybody knew. And everybody had wore his campaign buttons. Incidentally, the county courthouse was his campaign headquarters also. The entire courthouse was Snag Thompson's headquarters.
Jermaine.
So what else you got there?
Well, all sorts of red tide, erosion, all of those kinds of natural forces.
Red tide.
That one red tide was so sickening, I said, we've got to move off of here. There's all the dead fish in the canals, and well, we didn't, because no, I'm with the rescue squad, I'm with the fire department, we can't go. I heard that for years. But anyhow, so Marshall Tabaki took us in to Villa Capri, and at least that got us away, a little bit inland, away from those canals down there.
Because we lived right on the water.
Yeah, and it was sickening, and he took us in, dog and cat and everything, but
a prelude to the red tide was, I was on a rescue call, and it was in the evening, and coming back from Fort Myers, Preston Woodring was with me, and we were crossing the causeway coming home, and Preston said, "I think I smell red tide." And I knew absolutely nothing about red tide. Well, I sure learned fast, because about 1 month later was when it finally broke. And it was the vilest thing I ever encountered, because the only thing that I ever knew that could smell worse is a dead human being. Out in Sanibel Harbors, where we had the subdivision, that we had 2 model homes and the branch office out there, I used to sit out there sometimes 3 days a week. And I enjoyed it very much, because sometimes you'd go 2 whole days and you wouldn't see a car go by, except the mail carrier. There was one call beyond there where the old post office had been. And that was it. The cloud of dust, mail carrier going there, cloud of dust, mail carrier going back, and at 5 o'clock go back to the office, close the place up and go home. But there were so many dead fish in that area that there were a couple houses built, and one was owned by Timmy Squires. I don't know if you know Timmy. Timmy was working for Bob Stevens at that time. Stevens was a builder, Timmy was his designer and draftsman. And Timmy had this house out at Sanibel Harbors that it became very annoying to them to see a huge dead shark floating in the water. And Timmy towed that shark. He got a line around the tail. I don't know how he ever held his breath long enough to get that close. And towed it, I guess, halfway out into San Carlos Bay. And he swore that the shark that appeared there the next day, Timmy swore it was the same shark. Now, whether or not it was the same one, it doesn't really matter. But it was just wall to wall, and the odor was just beyond description. Erosion is something that, having lived in Captiva as many years as we did, we experienced in more ways than one. One was monetarily, by virtue of the taxation or assessment on it.
For the beach renourishment.
And but erosion is something that, for people who lived on Captiva, we can truthfully say we never believed that it could ever be conquered. And we don't believe it now, and we won't believe it tomorrow. We think that they're pumping money down a rat hole, and as soon as I retired, it was one of the, economically, it became imprudent for us to live there because we couldn't afford the taxes anymore. But erosion is something you don't fool with. You do whatever you want, but you're not going to win.
I agree.
You can quote me on it. Yeah.
Blind Pass did a lot of changing over the years.
Blind Pass on the old maps showed an exit down at this, what would be this end of Silver Key, going out into the Gulf at approximately the county easement that goes down onto Bowman's Beach, where they built a little bridge. And I was up there with a Volkswagen bus one very blustery day. It was just an off day. There was nobody around, and I guess you allowed me off for an hour to look at shells or whatever. And there was a small boat came down there with a husband, wife, and 2 or 3 children. And they used this old map that showed an exit. They were going to circumnavigate Sanibel Island in this, well, probably no more than a 14-foot boat, meaning they'd now have to go out into the Gulf. And I was able to, I saw them, and they couldn't find an exit. And they came over towards where they saw me. I was the only vehicle there and the only person that they could see. And they said, "How do you get out of here?" And I told them, "How do you get out all the way back?" So they were able to, they just couldn't believe that they would have to make that entire trip back the way they had come, through Pine Island Sand and whatever. But yes, it was open, then it was closed, and at the south, the easterly end, whatever you want to call this side of it, but the end up by the bridge, the Captiva Bridge, was Mitchell's Castaways, or what's now just Castaways. That little restaurant that's there, Roy Webb had also run that for years. And between that and the Gulf were boat docks. And they would rent boats there, which is now all sand. So it came and it went. It'll go again. Nobody just knows when. And where we lived on up on the Blind Pass there, that has filled in. But if it ever blitzes open again, then it's open. So it's, you can't miss it.
I remember prowling around in the earlier days. There had been a couple doctors on this island that they called Beach Baker and Bush Baker, and down Donax, down there somewhere was Beach Baker.
Yeah, in Shell Basket.
Yeah, and
That's why they call them Beach.
and Bush Baker was up here in Wilford.
At
And
Henderson's Cove.
And his house was just falling to pieces at that time, and I was snooping around, and I wish I just felt it, you know, I'm trespassing, it's not, I can't pick up stuff here, but there were medical records just blowing in the breeze through the house, and his instruments and all that stuff, which really would have been collector's items, and whatever became of it all, I don't know.
Yeah, he was dead, and it was just, the place was just abandoned.
The place was just abandoned there.
A very interesting thing about the Wolford area is when Arthur Gibson's family homesteaded out there, they of course knew every nook and corner of that enormous amount of acreage that exists in all of Wolford. And as years went by, it was...
Tom Mitchell?
Yeah, who preceded Tom Mitchell, the chain of title, the people of Chadwick's own that as a lime grove. And there are unquestionably thousands of lime trees that will be removed out there, all in rows and all under cultivation. Chadwick sold to Tom Mitchell, who was an early retiree from Chicago. He was, I forget, something in electronics, I believe, and probably retired at about the age of 40, and he and his wife owned all of that land, and heard that Arthur Gibson had lived there and wanted to locate a well, a deep well that had been, or at least a well that had been dug, so it wasn't a deep well. And Arthur drove out there Arthur, by the way, had an automobile that didn't, without benefit of license plates, and it had no floorboard in it, just pedals, because it had all been eaten away from the
Went through
salt.
the puddle, the water came right through it.
So Art chugged on out there. And
This
met
was for a
Mitchell.
fee, Art
And
wasn't
this
gonna
was,
do
no,
it
no,
for
this was
nothing
for a
either.
fee to locate that well. And the story goes that as they were roaming around in the bush and Art getting his bearings, Mitchell got grave doubts that maybe he had been taken, that no such thing existed. And Arthur, I'm sure in his prosaic manner, said, now if you walk over there between them trees or whatever, you'll come upon it. Well, Mitchell not only came upon it, he fell into it. So he made a believer out of it. And although I wasn't here to witness it, I don't think Arthur told wild stories.
No.
He was just a great old gentleman. Incidentally, he's buried up in the Captiva Cemetery. He died in 1970, in September of 70. And he was just a real gentleman.
Yeah, well, so
He was
we're,
involved in dredging. He ran a dredge. Jake Stokes, who became his nephew-in-law, if there is such a title. Arthur was the Pearl Stokes' natural uncle. So Jake worked for Art as a dredge boy back in the 20s. And into hurricanes.
can't think of their name, from the colony, they're buried up there too.
Monteith.
Monteiths.
And Monteiths were ahead of their time. We didn't know them, but they came from the same town in New Jersey we had lived in our final years in, namely Plainfield. Have you ever heard of Robert Monteith and Kay Monteith?
The name sounds familiar, but I'm not.
Well, they developed, he was an early retiree from Johnson & Johnson, and apparently came here with quite a substantial amount of money, bought all the land where the colony is, and started to, platted it into lots, and built, arranged to sell a piece of land. They're very much ahead of their time. This was in the 50s. And the person would build a duplex, and then they would rent the duplex out for them. So it was pre-condominium idea, but it still prevails all over this world, where you can buy a boat and have somebody rent it out for you. So it's like a chartering service. So they founded the colony, and they were both deceased by the time we arrived. But they also owned to the bay, and they sold off to Bill Way the land that Bill had.
But their son was still around, and Father Madden was in
he
charge of
he was his guardian.
his guardian.
But that was one of these early
And
developmental
I think about
things.
Jackie Redinger. I don't know if anybody knows where he wound up. His mother worked at Bailey's.
Yeah, Margot. Have you ever heard of Margot? Margot ran the clothing department at Bailey's. And incidentally, Bailey's old store, I'm sure you've heard this story, but there isn't a thing that Bailey has in this gigantic store that he didn't have in the old store. Because if he didn't have it, he could get it for you. And that was just the most marvelous
Well, Margot's
wildness over there.
Margot's
So-
husband was delivered mail here, didn't he?
Yeah, Joe Redinger.
Joe Redinger. He delivered the mail. He drowned, didn't he?
Mhm. He was fishing with Kenny Bryant and drowned off at Redfish Pass. And that's before we came. But they, I don't know,
But
you got
there's
anything else on your list there?
Yeah, I would like you to talk a little bit about the water, since you're on IWA, getting the water here, and I want to change the tab.
Water came to Sanibel as far as the official opening of taps where you could draw water out of the system in October of 1966, I believe it was. The very first tap to be opened was, to the best of my recollection, at Coconut Grove, and the second one was in the building where we were, because John Continus and Paul Stalin were on the water board. But the water board was formed as a volunteer situation to look into and examine the prudence of getting water, potable water, at a reasonable price and distributed to the residents here because people either had shallow wells, and all you had to do was knock a well point down with a sledgehammer, depending on the season of the year. Like right now, you go down about 1.5 feet, and you get water. In dry season, you maybe have to go 4 feet, and in most places get water, because we know the elevation here is so shallow. And with the advent of the causeway in '63, they had reasonable electricity here by that time, but they had no water. So some of the thinking people realized that in order to sustain growth, or to encourage growth and to sustain it, you had to have potable water. So through the use of government or federal loans, through the Farmers Home Administration, they were able to finance this installation of the plant, which was really just pump stations. They had no water plant. So the original water supply was purchased from Pine Island. Pipe came from St. James City over to Wolford. It came down Dixie Beach Boulevard, where the first pump station still exists, I'm sure, down
Palm Street.
yeah, Palm. And then there were, I guess, 2 other pump stations. And with the distribution of it, it was distributed through this miles and miles and miles of transite pipe that was laid. Transite, and you better all hold on when I use this term, is made out of asbestos. It was John's Manville Transit. And that's what everybody drank their water running through those pipes. I don't know when the last transite was removed or displaced, but I like to think it was a long time ago. Because now we even see that micronite filters from Kent cigarettes contain this magic stuff called asbestos. So the water system started out with one employee, namely Pat Murphy. Pat Murphy was Priscilla Murphy's first husband. And Pat was the only actual employee. Then when they got into operation, they had a part-time employee as a meter reader. That was Hap Payne. Hap served in many functions here through the many years. And there is a character of who we've loved for a long, long, long time. But
talk a little about him too.
Well, Hap was the meter reader, and Pat ran the office. And the office, as Mary's already indicated, was down in that little strip building next to the community church until they built the facilities up above by St. Isabel's. And St. Isabel's, just digress for a second, was a mission. It was not a church. It was a mission served out of Fort Myers Beach. And Mass was said in various homes. And prior to the causeway, the priest from Fort Myers Beach, the mother church, was Father Goni, who was a Basque, meaning from northern Spain. And he would come over in a boat, because that was cheaper than coming over on the ferry boat. And he'd come over from Fort Myers Beach in just minutes, which we, when we first came here, having no dentist or doctor, our son, well, we all went to Fort Myers Beach to a dentist, and our son would go by boat. It took him 8 minutes and no fee, and it would take us a half hour or more, and pay $3. Everything was $3. There was no discounts. There were no group rates. There were no seasonal or annual tickets. And Sanibel and Captiva, if they wanted to control growth, lost their opportunity when they made such a violent move to get that fee reduced. Because if there's anything we'll control, it's the one word called economics. But they blew it when they allowed that to happen. Because $3 in 1963, just imagine what $3 would buy then as compared to today. It would take you at least $45 to buy what 3 would then. Now, half-penny.
Well, I was just thinking, our son had to go to summer school. And he hit the front page of the Miami Herald or something. He went over there and argued with the commissioners about that $3 toll because he had to go over to Fort Myers every
They wouldn't
day.
relieve it.
And he had to have a car.
They would not relieve that fee.
No.
Now HAP, we came upon HAP, I guess, the very first day we got here, because HAP delivered the papers. HAP delivered numerous things through the years. Eggs. The ladies with the paper on Mother's Day always got
Flour. He might have picked it in the next yard, but it was
Well, yeah,
flour
but he
with your
also had
paper.
gladiolas and carnations and things. Hap is one of these individuals that for every pound that he weighs, he's got a 2-pound heart. And he's one of the most generous people we've ever known. Hap had lived in Fort Myers Beach prior to coming here, long before we knew him. He had been in a body cast and was very much immobilized, and Hap had problems since World War II in the Army with his back problems.
Well, as he said, whether he fell overboard or what, but he was always getting his cast wet. So finally, the doctor made one out of styrofoam, which was a lot better
Ahead
than plastic.
ahead of its time, too.
But
But then we had the good fortune of meeting him very early on, and he served us with the newspapers, and he read our water meter, and when we built our first home on Sanibel, Carl Whiteman was the contractor, and the very first person to come on the job had to, since it was a concrete block house, had to dig the perimeter of for the foundation. And foundations then only went down about 1 block. And this was manual labor with a shovel, and the first one on the scene was Hap Penn. I don't know if Hap put shoes on to work the shovel or not, probably not. But he was on the job, we were at the snack shack, and we got a call that he struck water.
we had a fountain.
And there was water gushing on the property. He had no idea where it was coming. Had it been oil, we would have been very wealthy.
No, it was Bill Way's
It was
water
Bill
line.
Way's semi-flexible water line that he ran up to the marina from his pump out by Periwinkle Way, and it was gushing about, I guess, 20 gallons of water a minute. By the time they got Bill down to shut the pump off and put a patch on it and reroute it, we lost at least a week or 2 of work. The first was in order for the water to settle out that had been laying on the ground. But whenever anybody needed some help, Hap was the one there.
Well, with fires, he'd come driving that little Volkswagen his right through the flames.
Oh,
With
when they
food or drink for the men.
when they dug the canals for Shell Harbor, a fire started in these so-called controlled burns, which meant you threw a match on some diesel fuel and walked away from it and came back the next morning. And that's how we spent 3 nights and 2 days on a fire down there, on and off that is, trying to control it, because it was in the month of February and March, very, very bitter cold and windy. And Hap was bringing us sandwiches and coffee, I guess, and he had a Volkswagen, a regular conventional bug, and you could see this pair of headlights through the flames. And they'd appear here and they'd appear over there and somewhere else. He had no way to cross the canal because they had dug all these bloody ditches, and he didn't know how to get to where we were. And finally he appeared on the scene. And how did he get there? Drove right through the flames. Now, these were not roaring flames. This was not like a movie. But this was the smoldering stuff. And Hap just drove through. Shortest distance between 2 places.
And he showed up when you had to go up north for your father.
He showed up, he demanded that he would take us to the airplane and demanded that he would be
wouldn't
there
take
to
the
pick us
$3
up
fee.
and paid the $3 fee.
And he even offered to babysit our 2 children, but I didn't take him up on that.
But speaking of the airplane, now this I think is something that if it isn't in the record, it should be, because not only everybody on Sanibel who flew here, but everybody in Lee County. When we came here, and until 1967 or 8, Page Field, the only airport, was only large enough to land prop jets. So, and the only airline was National Airline. They were not large enough to land regular jets. And they had no radio. The only contact that, or the information the pilot had in coming and approaching that air strip of the field over there was to read the windsock. And this is absolutely true in the old-fashioned manner. Now, every airport still has a windsock because there's a last-minute check. It's something that has to be done. But that was their only observation, and then they'd go back into it, climb again, and go back into a landing pattern in order to come and make their approach and landing. When they finally installed a radio, it was the station manager for National Airline that would go up on the roof. And the roof was only 2 stories up. It's the top of where that restaurant is now, and at Page Field. And then he put on his earphones and then a hard hat. And you'd know which way to look for the airplane because that would be the direction that man would be facing. And then you'd see him with his little microphone and talking in and out of it. And when the plane touched the wheels down, the station manager took his hard hat off, laid it down, took his earphones off, climbed down the ladder, and then was down on the tarmac to give him the signals to come into where to chop the plane. And then he would participate in rolling over the ladder that you'd climb out of, because there was none of this modern stuff, including the wonderful thing of the luggage. All the baggage was put under an open lean-to. There was no protection other than if the rain came straight down.
Well, that was just like the Christmas packages at the old post office.
Okay.
Everything was outside under, there wasn't room to bring it in the building.
One final thing about the Page Field was we went away on our 25th anniversary back in 1973. We went away for 6 weeks. We parked our car, and when we came back, we put the keys in, it started up and drove off, and no charge, because there was no parking fees.
And no vandalism.
Now tell them about the other post office.
Well, I was just saying that all the packages that came
Yeah, but I
Christmas
mean,
time were out on the back lean.
Tell them about the cat.
The cat, well, Scotia had this huge
Scotia Bryant.
cat that lay right on the window. You had to get your stamps or anything else over the cat's back.
Well, there were 2 windows, and if you were didn't want to wait, you went by the cat window.
Well,
but when Scotia
it was
retired,
nice to have things without all the firm rules that you had to live by.
mail delivery did not take place, home delivery did not commence until you were at least a mile from the post office. So we, at that time, lived down at near the Seahorse Shop at Bill Way's area, and so we would walk to the post office. But then, of course, when Scotia, coincident with Scotia's retirement, was when they built this new post office. So, what
I
else?
worked there for a year.
At the note.
Yeah, I had one step into being postmistress when we moved to Captiva, and I thought, oh no, never. Esperanza didn't talk to us for a year when we moved to Captiva. No, we went up there with the rich people.
Yeah, she thought we became
Deserters.
She thought we became snobs. Yeah, she did.
So you can imagine.
Talk some more about Esperanza. You're part of the ancient.
Esperanza, as I said, is one of the most fascinating ladies I've ever known in my life. We totally
She gave us our dog. Our little puppy was a thoroughbred poodle that some relatives of hers in Punta Gorda raised, and so. Well, she didn't give it. They donated it to Bishop Barreau, and our daughter won it on a 50-cent chance. So now and Esperanza came into the snack shack with this pretty dog bed, all done up, and she wanted to give it to us. And I said, well, no, I'll buy it from you. No. She said, I can't give a bed for my dog. And that was her puppy. So she gave Boo his bed.
Yeah, we just saw her about a month ago. There was a memorial service for her sister Amelia over at Resurrection Church, and that's the last we've seen her.
Mm-hmm.
But she, everything about her is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, when we go fishing with her, of course, she threw her cast net out, she caught her own bait, and Marty can't catch a fish fish. We'd be out there all day long, and she'd catch them, I'd catch them. We'd go for trout, we'd go for redfish, we'd go here and there, and she didn't want to bring us back in until he caught one, and we'd
I
still
couldn't
be out
catch a
there.
fish in the aquarium. But Esperanza and the whole Woodring, what would you say, the family tree of the Woodrings, and then of Esperanza's side, very, very interesting. Woodrings, I think historically came from Erie, Pennsylvania, homesteaded out there. And of course, the part of that area that they subdivided and platted is in Plat Book 1. I think it's page 8 of Lee County Public Records. I know it's in Plat Book 1, but I think it's page 8. That only indicates how long it's been there. And the point of origin in any subdivision, each lot has a point of beginning, but a subdivision has a point of origin where everything is derivative from. And if one goes in and reads the public record of Woodring subdivision, S.B. Woodring, Samuel B., it will show that all those bearings start from a buttonwood tree. And I'm all goose flesh just thinking of this, because this is how things were done in 1900. And I think that's the year it was platted. Esperanza married Sam Jr., or Sam, in, I guess it was, well, somewhere probably in around 1920 or so. She was a Padilla, P-A-D-I-L-L-A, and she was born, as I recall her stories, I think she was born on Cayo Costa, or La Costa, however you want to call it. She went to school by boat until I guess they disbanded the school boats up there. As Joe Whiteman went to school on Sanibel for a while up by Mitchell's. In fact, Joe went with Dean Mitchell. They were a one-home affair, of course. And I'm sure you're all aware that Sanibel had two post offices, the Sanibel post office and the Wolford. There was actually a stamp, a bull stamp, that said Wolford, Florida. I don't know if you have any in your collection, but if you don't, you ought to try to get one because it could be a valuable asset. But Esperanza's family, I believe, were part Seminole and part Canary Island. And Canary, which would be Spanish. And they, of course, are just totally interesting. Every facet of the family. I've never come upon anything that didn't interest me regarding them. And I think that some of her stories about Sam in bootlegging days were just out of this world because...
Yes, do you remember the one where the sheriff from Fort Myers came over to raid the place?
Sam was visited one day, because this man came over, I suppose, on ferry, and he was I guess the sheriff of Lee County or one of the senior deputies, I'm not sure which it was, but came to visit Sam to apprehend him, to take him into the jail. And the reason being because he was trading in bootlegging. Sam didn't make it, he just handled it, because he was knowledgeable about the boats and where to hide it out on Esperanza. Used the term for one of the islands out in St. Carlos Bay as Whiskey Island, where they could dump this stuff. I guess it had high enough land that you could get it and hide it behind the mangrove. And how they would be out on the water, and they knew that the revenuers were after them, so they, of course, run without any lights and purposely bait the boat that was following them to run aground, up on an oyster bar preferably. But the story that that you wanted me to get onto was when this sheriff or deputy was there. Sam said, well, as long as you're here, you may just as well have a couple drinks. So of course, because that was part of the life of being in the sheriff's department, you're going to take me in, let's down a few. So Sam got the deputy, or the sheriff, we'll call him, I guess totally blind. So he never got to take him in. And when he woke up the next morning, Sam told him to get the hell out of there and don't come back. Because I never want to see you again. I'll turn you in for being drunk and I'll get witnesses to swear to it that you were drunk on duty. So that was the end of that. Sam also had signs, beware of bear traps. That he supposedly had some bear traps out planted in Woodring's area to keep snoopers away. Now whether or not he had these doesn't really matter. It was the idea that it kept the law a little bit at bay.
Well, was it the grandchildren or what that she had raking up the yard there, and then they went to burn what they had raked up, and pretty soon the bottles were popping and the blue flames were going all over the place. Apparently Sam had buried some in the yard that she didn't even know about that suddenly appeared.
Yeah, blue flames reminds me of the Sanibel fire. The Sanibel fire, I've been on numerous fires through the years, had to have been probably the most gigantic one I had ever experienced, because we lived down there, as we said, down by Anhinga, and Sanibel hasn't moved, so on a straight line it's a couple miles away, and
You could see the
and
flames.
it was just like daylight. It was just absolutely
And
scary.
the things that were there,
But
the
this-
pictures of Edison and Ford and the collections, and everything that just went down with that building was a shame.
The heat was so intense that they had just gotten a load of shipment of liquor the day before, or 2 days before, and these bottles would pop and the blue flame would come out of those. But the intensity of the heat was such that the steel lolly columns, these upright supports for the building, were all like hairpins. Everyone just turned like a hairpin.
What year?
We still had the snack shack, about 67 or 80. I'd guess it to be 67.
Mm.
It was a brutal fire. No one was killed. The only person I ever knew to have been killed in a fire locally was at one on the south end, this end of Captiva. He was living in Rent, and it was presumed that he had been under some influence, whether it was liquor or drugs, and he was cremated in it because he didn't find him until the body was found. First a dead dog was found the next morning when daylight came. But that's the only death I ever heard of.
Well, we were told of one back in the 40s.
Could very well be. It's the only one I know. That could very well be. But there have been a lot of carnage here with automobiles, particularly on Captiva. The S-turns on Captiva.
Well, the S-turn by the Legion.
And the S-turn by
Time
the
and
Legion,
again.
I was involved with that one when they were playing chicken on the kids.
Yeah, did you know he called bingo numbers for 7 years at the
6.5.
Legion? 6.5. And we would pick
Euros.
up Clarence and Art, and I'd sit between them, and one couldn't hear too well, the other couldn't see too well, and I'm trying to work my boards and help Clarence and help Art. But when it came time to yell bingo, the Murex. Murex.
Yeah,
Bingo was
we
illegal.
took
We called it
Clarence and
Murex.
Art to Murex for a few years. And I knew I had it made here when a certain thing occurred. Uncle Art always called me boy. Well, I was younger at one time. But that was his greeting. Morning boy, evening boy, or whatever. And finally one day he called me Marty, and he never called me boy after that. And I knew I had it made. I was accepted into the inner circle.
Well, and with Clarence, when he toward in later years, when he couldn't see well enough to drive, he had to give up his driver's license, and that was a hardship for him. But he said to me, geez, he said, before I die, one thing I really want, I've never had Okeechobee catfish. And I knew he was hinting. I took him to the racetrack because I knew he made that very clear. He wanted to go to the dog track. But when he wanted to go to Okeechobee for catfish, to me that was an awful long drive, and I just didn't want to do it. So what we did was we got one of the EMTs who was coming in from that way, brought a big box of Okeechobee catfish in for us, and then I got from Uncle Art, I got the recipe for the hush puppies,
Yeah.
and I made hush puppies and catfish, the one and only time I've ever made catfish. And we had Uncle Art and Scotty
Scotty Gale.
Gale for dinner. And boy, through the hush puppies and the catfish show.
Uncle Art supervised the making of hush puppies at the Legion for many years. It was done in a grand style. It was done in great volume. And I don't remember the ingredients. I know there was cornmeal and there was a lot of beer that went into it. And it was done in a tub that was so big that I had to wear the long arm. And when this hit the top of the tub, I could just about get my hand down the bottom because you needed it with your hand. You were actually, you took your shirt off and you needed it with your hand.
Hope you washed your armpit.
Well, they were cooked wrong. But it was Art who was it was his recipe, and it was Art who tasted it to decide when it was right. And he would stick his finger down and taste it. Add another case of beer. So you throw in another case of beer. And then slosh around in there, and then some more taste, and then add a little of this, add a little of that. Finally, it was seal of approval. And it was, I guess, Clarence who decided when the fires were the right temperature. Because to fry anything, particularly over open wood, is not an easily controllable thing. And you started this huge blaze and kept that thing going and stoking it. But to keep the temperature, the only way you can balance it then is to put fish or whatever into it to consume the heat. Because there's no way in the world you're going to lift that up and take it away. But they always played their important roles up there and sort of officiated, because everyone would make it a point to go over and shake hands with each other. It's quite a day for whenever the fish fries.
Go back to the community house a little bit. You mentioned the Audubon Society, but also the community house. I was asked about the earlier days as far as the Audubon Society. Some of the presidents, evidently they don't have any of their minutes before 1975.
Really?
They don't.
So any information you might have there would be helpful too. But
Probably the Griffin Bancroft would probably be of help. He lives down in Bentley Village now. If I think of names, I'll write them down and I'll make a note and I'll call you. But
Mario Hutton was
well, Mario
involved,
Hutton is
but
long
he's long
deceased.
gone,
He,
but was involved.
he was deeply involved. In fact, it became sort of Mario's personal marching and chowder society, which, and maybe that sounds nasty the way I put it, but Mario had his slides and his
Poems.
yes, it was a photo verse, which he did an extremely marvelous job with it. They had, I suppose, an array of speakers and presentations that were totally out of this world. There was one speaker I had heard twice. He gave the same type of show in each. And this was a man named Dr. Myrick, who taught at University of Florida in Gainesville, who could do a show for at least an hour with 4 or 5 slides. And just project the slide, and as he spoke, that bird that he was displaying actually was moving. It became alive. It took to flight and so forth. This is all with one slide. This is the type of people that they were able to get to display. They had a man lived out in what's called Castaways subdivision along the main road, Sandcap Road. Hal Harrison was a photographer, a wildlife photographer for, I think, Warner Brothers. He would project the films. He used his own projector, which was totally, probably the most expensive thing you could lay your hands on when it was built. By the time he used it here, it was at least 10 years old, but in mint condition. And I used to assist him in various presentations, which gave me an insight to some of these things. And Harrison was able to give some lectures too and explain how sometimes you'd be out on, well, I'll call it safari, they have another term, like bivouacking out there on your own for maybe a week at a time, just to try to catch a couple feet of one animal or bird, and maybe have total disaster. Bloody thing never appeared, and there's no way you're going to get it to. As far as meetings and the inner workings of it, I really will try to come up with some names.
Was Howard Schreiner in it at
No.
all? No. Jeannie Hopwood took bird tours, people out on bird tours.
She wrote a little bird
Yeah.
She
book,
wrote a bird
yeah.
book, yes, she did. Unfortunately, she didn't have the money to have it done in color, but Leroy Friday printed it up for her. He had a printing press.
Leroy had a printing press about this big, and it was a hand-operated thing. No, I'm sorry, it had an electric motor on it, but he hand-fed it, and it was for
He's still here.
what you call letterpress.
I'm not sure if he's on the aisle.
I don't know, but I think he's still alive.
Yeah.
But Leroy's little press, he did all the menus for us and most of the other people for Nutmeg House. The Nutmeg, you ever interviewed the Nutmeg House? They're fantastic because they were involved with many, many, many interesting people. Their own relatives and friends, the Bill Hymans and so forth. Yeah, very interesting people. But I really couldn't tell you from memory much about the meetings.
What other things went on at the community house?
Oh, they had teen club there. They had, that would go on and off for, I guess, through many years. They had, the thing of the year was always the show fair.
And the Christmas parties, Red
Christmas
Shine,
parties.
what we sang.
Oh, yeah,
What's her name
Bob
played?
Chaplin, Marion Chaplin.
Marion Chaplin played the piano and
She
sang some
did
of
her
her
own
songs,
compositions,
which were very good.
and they had, it was really the center of activity. At the time it was expanded, which would have been somewhere in the, I guess, the late 60s, maybe 1970, from its original structure, which you have a picture of in here. Only 3 or 4 men did just about every bit of the work on it. They were Tom Nix, Floyd Flew, Jerry Martin, and Bill Newman. Bill Newman ran the Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber of Commerce was in the community house, and the Chamber of Commerce consisted of a desk of, I guess, you might say, ancient vintage, and probably 1 file cabinet. And the visiting nurse came over, was it twice a month or once a month?
I don't remember.
And she had that little back storeroom. And that's where she had her wares in a little bag that she'd bring in. And if you needed a vaccination or whatever, you went to the visiting nurse with no charge. So that was a pleasant thing to know that you were still rural enough to have that.
Goldie Lundberg ran the elections.
You were on the election board for many, many, many years.
Many years.
Clarence.
After Goldie gave up her position, Clarence got it, and I ran it for Clarence.
They were down, that was down the old
Down the old
firehouse.
firehouse.
Yeah.
And you'd have to
That had no
stand out in
doors.
the mosquitoes and the rain and whatnot in line to get in to vote.
With no
You
doors.
couldn't get in until it was time to vote, so we were all lined up outside in the weather. The mosquitoes were something else again.
Yeah, that was a real problem. The mosquito control has, of course, done such a fantastic job in Lee County that I don't know if anyone has brought this to your attention, that at least years ago, entomologists from all over the world would come and study their programs here, from Beltsville, Maryland, and as far away as Africa, to study Wayne Miller's operation known as the Lee County
We got to
mosquito.
interview Wayne Miller, and it was fascinating. With
Well, that was-
Francis and with John Contini.
Yeah, because they were deeply involved. And as Uncle Clarence would say, in the old days you could take a 2-gallon bucket and swing it once and come up with 10 gallons of mosquitoes or whatever the equivalence was. But the mosquitoes were still darn thick when we first came here, and we would run into the Volkswagen bus, get it moving, and then open the flap windows on it to try to draw the mosquitoes that came on your body out of the van. And we lived our first couple of years. We lived 2 years in Bill Way's, and we lived 1 year in the first house we had on Captiva without benefit of air conditioning. And that was hot. That was warm. But the mosquitoes, and of course the no-see-ums, they still can't figure out how to kill one of them. Well, I guess if you got enough for us?
If you're aware of that.
You got any more, sweetie?
No, not that I can think of. I really appreciate it.
Well, we appreciate the opportunity to share some of this
Yeah,
information with you.
Yeah.
This was a great opportunity for us to get out of metropolitan New York, and a great opportunity for us to find a way of life that was a tremendous improvement for us. And
Well, we were down here sort of thinking about purchasing a ski lodge up in New Hampshire. That's what we
Yeah.
really were aiming for.
that's
You
right.
went in a different direction.
We went in a different
Well,
direction.
we came down here just for a vacation and fell in love with it.
Yeah.
3 weeks later, I was back with the kids, and that was it. But at that time, the reef was for sale for $300,000, in case you wanted it. And,
Yeah.
we looked at a number of things. There's one up here on Periwinkle Apartments, I guess it was called. That was about $27,000. And the house
Yeah,
we
before
rented-
Danny Moore bought it.
Yeah, before Danny Moore bought it. Danny and Holly.
Well, Gulfront land
22,000
was
for
high.
100 feet of
Well,
Gulf
that
Front
was commercial
about
zone.
it.
If you were 22, because 17.5 was the price of when Tahiti Shore subdivision opened. And that 17.5 became close to $1 million.
Yeah.
Same land, maybe a little less of it, because I took a beating.
Because it's eroding, yeah.
Well, we thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
What do you think of, I bought Isabel's tavern? And I said, why? Or whatever. And he said, well, I can get hold of it with, I think it was $50,000. And I gave him real sage advice. I said, Scotty, I wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. Scotty bought it and made a fortune in it.
Scotty